You and I, as Iranians and people who live in the US, who are part of the masses or the working class, have more in common with each other than we do with our own governments. Our generation is slowly starting to see that. The same apparatus that killed Renee Good is the same apparatus that is part of a genocide in Palestine that will willingly do a regime change in Iran. It's just like becoming more evident that we have common enemies around the world. But I think there is a question of organization, and it goes back to even what I was just saying earlier. How do we organize ourselves independently from below?
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. First of all, let me wish all of our comrades listening a very happy new year. 2026 has been very eventful so far, and one of the places where this is particularly true is Iran. A revolt broke out in Iran right before the new year, and it's led to some of the most important mass mobilizations in recent years. By some estimates, although it's hard to know because of the internet blackout in the country, hundreds of thousands have been protesting the current regime, particularly in response to an inflation crisis. Protesters have been violently repressed, thousands have already been killed, far more have been injured and also arrested. These protests didn't come out of nowhere, though. The initial spark may have been related to the dire economic situation, the inflation that I mentioned earlier, but there is a broader context here. In Iran, there have been years of protest waves recently, especially from around 2017. 2022 in particular was a huge protest year after the murder of Mahsa Amini in police custody. Imperialism also has a huge role to play here. The Iranian economy has been absolutely decimated for years by crushing sanctions imposed by both the US and European countries. These sanctions have been devastating for the working class in particular. As you may have been following recently, the attacks on Iran have intensified under President Trump, of course. But we need to be clear that these attacks, including sanctions and so-called pressure tactics on Iran, have been sustained through bipartisan consensus. So they've been pursued through both US parties, including the Democrats, and they are sustained through international alliances too, and, like I mentioned, through European countries as well. So why is the US doing this? What exactly is the point of the US's tactics and interventions here? Trump obviously is couching his threats against Iran as being about human rights and about democracy, freedom, just like Republicans and Democrats have always done. Like, we've heard this before, right? And it's kind of the same refrain that US imperialism gives us as cover for so many violent imperialist policies, so many imperialist interventions. You, the smart listener of this podcast, will not be surprised to hear that in reality, the US is of course not motivated by human rights, by freedom, by democracy, by its kind, angelic little heart that just wants the best for the world. No, the US is motivated by imperialist interests. And these interests are rooted in Iran's strategic weight as a resource-rich regional adversary. This is important in the even broader context, one that we've talked about again and again, of declining US power or hegemony and increasing inter-imperialist rivalries. Although me and my guest today, my Left Voice comrade Maryam Alaniz, are discussing Iran today, it's important to keep in mind that Trump's aggressive stance here isn't limited to Iran or even to the Middle East. As you know, and I'll link to our episode on this in the show notes, Trump is waging an offensive against Venezuela as well, recently kidnapping President Nicolas Maduro. And even here in the US, we're seeing the same repressive apparatus being used to discipline immigrants and social movements, like we saw with the recent murder of Renee Nicole Good by ICE agents in Minneapolis. I'm saying this and I really want to sort of pause on it for a moment to emphasize, as my comrade Maryam does in this episode, that these struggles are connected. These are not, isolated events just like happening at the whims of Trump's moods. So we'll get more into that today. So what's the way forward for Iran? Well, first, we need to be clear eyed about the current Iranian regime. This regime isn't like an innocent target of imperialism, it's actually a ruling class force trying to preserve its own power. President Masoud Pezeshkian has imposed austerity measures. He has brutally repressed the Iranian masses. He is not a progressive option for the Iranian working class. Then, on the other hand, there's Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah of Iran. Restoring him to power, though, backed by Trump and other imperialist powers, would only mean Iran's total subordination to imperialism, the plunder of Iran's resources, like oil, and ramping up the exploitation of the Iranian working class. So again, to be clear, we cannot support Reza Pahlavi here. A puppet monarchy also is not a progressive option for the Iranian masses. So instead of liberal reforms from above, regime change imposed from imperialist powers on the outside, the Iranian working class can play a central role. It can intervene, organized, independently, against the current regime and against imperialism. It can use the tools of the working class, like a political general strike, to bring down the regime and avert the restoration of a puppet monarchy. And a victory for the Iranian working class would have importance way beyond Iran's borders. It would reverberate across the whole region, including in places like Palestine, which we also discussed today, and it could be the foundation of genuine democracy, inseparable from the socialist reorganization of society. Make sure to check out leftvoice.org for our coverage on Iran and related issues. If you want to support Left Voice, you can go to patreon.com/leftvoice. Follow us on social media where we use the handle left_voice. Here is my interview with Maryam. Maryam, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'd love to start with an overview of what exactly is happening in Iran. What sparked the current protests and how has the government responded?
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but to try and explain at least what's going on more in the immediate conjuncture, the protests actually started on December 28th, and Iran's economic crisis has been ongoing for quite some time now. As you can imagine, it has a lot to do with the sanctions. The sanctions continue to increase. In September, there was another round of sanctions that were applied, as well as in the past few days after the protests. And there has basically been a hyperinflation scenario. The Iranian rial is basically worth next to nothing when it's put up to other currencies, and it's obviously affecting the working class, but also sectors of the middle class. And historically speaking, the bazaar, which is where a lot of I guess it's an ancient shopping mall, I don't know how else to put it, but it's an important sort of like center of economic activity or a barometer for how deep the crisis is. And the shopkeepers of the bazaar decided like this situation is so untenable that we're just going to close and basically organize a shutdown of the bazaar. And I think that triggered a more widespread revolt, which obviously also comes on the heels of a imperialist offensive in Iran that has a lot to do with the war, the 12-day war with Israel. So the economic situation has been on the downturn, and it's, to me, not surprising to see young people, working class people, and even some sectors of the middle class take to the streets and protest in the way that they have. And after the protests started, there were also different sectors like the student movement, folks who live in different regions in Iran that are particularly oppressed, like in Loristan and also in Kurdistan, be particularly important sites of the protest movement that has erupted. It's interesting because I think it's not the best timing for the Iranian regime. Like I said, they're dealing with losing a lot of their sort of like regional influence because of the Zionist offensive, and obviously the economic situation creates a more generally unstable situation in the country. So initially, the Iranian president, Mahmoud Pezeshkian, who actually comes from a more reformist, quote unquote, sector of the regime, maybe another way to say it is moderate, but obviously he's still pro regime. It's not like the way that we talk about Bernie Sanders or anything like that. It's reformism in the theocratic context. He attempted to dialogue with the protest movement and essentially was saying that the protesters have a right to protest. He understands that there's economic hardships, and the regime even went as far as offering $7 a month as a subsidy to cover the inflation, and also like there was a recent increase in fuel prices. But even in Iran, where maybe $7 is worth more than it is here, it was still kind of like, an insult or a super weak band-aid to gloss over the situation. And from there, the protests, from my understanding, of course, we have limited information because of the internet blackouts. But from my understanding, from there, the protests actually expanded. There was more generalized anger. And that was when the regime sort of switched to taking a more hardline approach, kind of unleashing full frontal assault on the protesters, doing everything it can to repress the movement, including over 2,000 murders at the very least, and over 18,000 arrested at the very least, 800 people with death sentences. At the same time, the regime also tried to organize a protest to show the sectors of the masses and to show kind of more of a united front among its different wings as a counter protest to the movement. From my understanding, it was a one-day protest. So now it's a more defensive situation for the movement since there's been that change.
From what you're saying, it sounds like there is obviously like a much broader context surrounding these protests rather than just like one simple event or one catalyst. I know there are, so many pieces to talk about here. You already mentioned, for example, like sanctions, the 12-day war with Israel. Can you talk a little bit more about this broader context, though, leading up to Iran, some of these more kind of economic and imperialist factors?
There's been sort of in the region an offensive between US imperialism and its regional allies, which obviously include Netanyahu, but also the Arab bourgeoisies, who in one way or another collaborate or capitulate to the US line. And Iran has become increasingly isolated in that sense. The Iranian regime faces that challenge from above, but I think something that I haven't talked about as much is the crisis of legitimacy that's been developing from below. Since 2017, there's been almost every year protests close to this scale. And in 2022, of course, we saw some of the most important mobilizations, the feminist revolts that erupted after the heinous murder of Mahsa Amini. And so I think it's a particular moment where the country is dealing with challenges in the context of an imperialist offensive in the region, in the context of the US losing its influence around the world and trying to do anything possible to reinsert that influence, as we're seeing not only in the Middle East, but also in Latin America with the sort of neo-colonial plan that Trump is trying to impose in Venezuela, and even the murder in Minneapolis, because at the same time, it's important for US imperialism to discipline its own working class and its own social movements because the key to breaking all of this really is if, especially if the working class in the heart of imperialism expresses any sort of solidarity with workers in other countries and denounces its own imperialist regime. And so that's why we're seeing this sort of, it's almost like, a police state emerge through ICE and through the anti-migrant offensive that I think is also very much linked to this broader imperialist offensive in a situation where US imperialism is in crisis.
You talked about the US reasserting influence, and I think this is super important from this like kind of imperialist point. So here in the United States, obviously a big reason why we're hearing so much about the protests in Iran is because President Trump has threatened to intervene. He's kind of gone back on that now and has decided momentarily not to intervene, I guess. But why exactly is the US threatening to intervene in Iran? And why are they supporting Reza Pahlavi? Is he a progressive alternative, for example, to the current regime?
I mean, I think like it has a lot to do with the fact that the US has been pursuing a sort of regime change policy, and the sanctions are definitely a part of that, right? It's a sort of tactic in the framework of attempting to change the regime in Iran to a regime that is more friendly to US interests. Of course, the regime in Iran is a bourgeois regime, so it's not entirely hostile to US interests either. And that's why at certain points in its history, it's negotiated with US imperialism in order to preserve itself. And US imperialism has found itself in a position to try and negotiate with the Iranian regime. Even in this moment, it's considering that pathway. But why have one Israel in the Middle East when you can have five? I don't know. Definitely before the Iranian Revolution, in some ways, like Iran was a bastion of US interests under the dictatorship of Reza Pahlavi's father, which was heroically overthrown by the Iranian masses in a scenario of deep repression that in some ways parallels the repression that we're seeing today under the Islamic Republic. So this struggle for democracy has been ongoing for many, many years. And even though Donald Trump has this rhetoric of, oh, we want democracy in Iran and we don't want anyone to be executed, his idea of democracy is democracy for the bourgeoisie. It's more democracy, more freedom for people of his class, especially people of his class in the United States. Reza Pahlavi, obviously, like his father, and in some ways his grandfather before him, he comes from a long line of puppets. So maybe he seems like the immediate option. Like he's literally been, he comes from, a legacy of puppetry, US puppetry. So it seems almost like the
Yeah.
best option. But of course, even Trump himself has had to admit that he does not have popular support in some ways, or even if it's implicit in Iran, even though obviously there are sectors of the diaspora that have more monarchist leanings. That in and of itself kind of expresses this sort of like sense, and maybe it's not expressed in a more like overt way, but even the sense among the Iranian masses that anything that the US does to intervene is going to be in its own interests, and that this is not the most progressive outcome. And I think that especially has been growing since the 12-day war, because there were like a ton of people who died in the attacks, like just innocent civilians. And even older generations might have like memories of the 1953 coup in Iran. That's why there's even this like maybe latent sense that this is not the way to go. And I can say even among like a lot of young people in the diaspora, especially those who are coming from the pro-Palestine movement and have seen the way that Pahlavi has shaken his hands with Netanyahu and is very, very clearly representing Zionist interests. Those are just some of the small indicators of the direction things might go in if this plan that the US has been baking up for decades actually materializes.
I want to come back to one kind of interesting thing you said earlier that I thought was kind of funny. You said, why have one Israel in the region when you could have five. And I like this because I think it hints at what people rightly describe Israel as, which is the US's kind of attack dog in the Middle East region. But I wanted to ask a little bit more detailed about like what exactly that would give to the US. Like it might sound a little bit obvious, like, okay, of course the US wants control in that area. And we talk a lot about, the US wants hegemony, the US wants influence. But concretely, like what would it do for the United States to have a US compliant regime in Iran? Like, for example, is access to the oil market in Iran, is that, for example, a big motivation for the United States here?
Yeah, it's not a side note that Iran has this history of one dictatorship after another. It's to me very much linked to, on the one hand, I would say its oil reserves, which are among the largest in the world, and even its geographical proximity to other oil reserves in the region. And also, in that sense, it's sort of for millennia been a geographical crossroads between the East and the West, and sort of has this unique position. So I would say that that is definitely factoring into the calculus because that's the way that imperialism works. And we are seeing that super clearly with Venezuela as well. But obviously, this point of trying to transform Iran into another Israel, which obviously, even I think within the regime within the Trump administration seems like a far off plan because anything the US has done in the past 20 years in the Middle East has basically backfired. Even in some ways, you could say the current imperialist offensive in Gaza has backfired in its own way because it's created a pro Palestine movement and greater questioning of imperialism around the world. So the US is, even though it's literally like salivating over this possibility of getting access to the oil reserves and a country that has such a also powerful 90 million people, like working class, it seems far off because even Trump himself knows that there could be a lot of unintended consequences. And so that's why there were divisions within the Trump administration. Should we strike? Should we not? Even Netanyahu wasn't sure about what to do. It really shows that, like, even if I were in a position of wanting regime change in Iran, it's not going to be as easy as US imperialism wants, especially in a context where they're very much in crisis.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the divisions in the Trump administration. I actually wonder if it would be worth talking a little bit about like divisions in kind of the broader parts of the regime and the US government. What is the perspective of Republicans writ large? What is the perspective of the MAGA base, many of whom I would say, like I'm thinking, for example, the Tucker Carlson sectors would call themselves like anti interventionist? And at the risk of kind of smashing a little bit too much here into one question, what is the perspective of the Democrats? Are the Democrats heroically marching into Congress with their anti imperialist flags? I mean, of course they're not, but what is the perspective of the Democrats here?
I think that, of course, all of these parties are imperialist parties. So the end goals and the objectives are very much one and the same. But it's true, like you're sort of pointing to, that there's been among the MAGA base, especially after the disaster in Gaza, there's been a greater questioning of intervention, especially in the Middle East. I think that has a lot to do with the disasters in Iraq and Afghanistan, where, a lot of even like working class people who might not necessarily be anti imperialist were sent and put their bodies on the line to kill other working class people for the interests of US multinationals. So I think that there is a greater questioning, and that presents a challenge for Trump in a moment where he and obviously even the sectors of the Democratic Party want to reassert US hegemony around the world. So that's definitely a contradiction that exists. And I think we've seen some ruptures, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene and certain figures rupture in a more like open way, but unless those sectors like link their frustration to what's really at play here, which is like capitalism and imperialism, then it's very easy for them to be co-opted back into the fold of like, we can sometimes do things and things can go okay, which is kind of what they're trying to do in Venezuela, to try and convince those sectors that, maybe it's not always bad and we should try and like, do this new Monroe Doctrine and seize Greenland and all of that. So that's why it's still very dangerous if it's sort of like left unchecked. In terms of the Democrats, I think they have been definitely putting forward, and I think the European powers are putting forward a similar line of emphasizing a lot the question of human rights in Iran, obviously still towards a perspective of regime change, but more through that lens. And I think that appeals maybe to the sensibilities of like more just everyday people around the world. And in that sense, it could be hard to see how they are also using sort of that as a cover for their, at the end of the day, unity with the other wings of like the imperialist regime and also with Zionism. And so in that sense, I think it's been interesting, but at the same time, I haven't seen, I think there's like a little bit of an exhaustion with that as well, because, we saw like that empty rhetoric when Biden was president too, you know what I mean? Like, and even Obama, who was like the drone king, right? Like talked about human rights, but was literally the drone king. So, and then obviously like under Biden, everything that happened with Gaza and the genocide, right? So I think that's why like the Democrats have been super delegitimized around just anything related to imperialism and foreign policy and all of that. That's why we're seeing a lot of young people looking for more progressive answers. And I think it's up to us on the left to try and put forward a real alternative that doesn't really fall into any of these camps, which also includes the camps that end up supporting the Iranian regime.
One final actor in the situation that I think it's worth talking about a little bit is European countries, which I don't want to sort of let off the hook here. I mean, obviously, we're going to focus a lot on the US here because that's where we are. We call it the belly of the imperialist beast. And in the situation with Iran, clearly Trump's rhetoric and his bloodlust is very striking. So it's easy to focus on that. But where is Europe in this? Are they also sanctioning Iran, for example?
Yeah, I think it's great that you brought that up, because they are sort of like trying to position themselves to the left of Trump and maybe in some ways emphasizing more their, disgust for the repression and this and that. But it was, I think, 2 days ago that they implemented a new round of sanctions and are mostly trying to operate through sort of like international institutions that really play in the hands of like US interests at the end of the day. It's almost like theatrical, right? So in that sense, it really shows like Europe's subordination to US imperialism, but also in the same way, the role that it plays in continuing to perpetuate this sort of miserable situation. And I haven't really looked into it, but something else that I wanted to raise about just how contradictory all of this is going back to Trump for a second. He, I think it was a few days ago, implemented a new immigrant visa ban on 75 countries. This is on top of the Muslim ban and on top of countless other policies that have already restricted immigration, but particularly immigration from Iran. And I think that's another way that we're seeing a lot of these imperialist countries try and discipline workers in semi-colonial countries that are bearing the brunt of the crises that are created by imperialism. So these countries from Europe to the US have no right to speak about their empathy or sympathy for the Iranian masses, because everything that they're doing in reality, in action, is to make life harder for the majority of working class people around the world.
Clearly, we don't support the current regime in Iran. And as you just outlined, obviously, we don't support US or European imperialism, and we don't support Reza Pahlavi. So I want to ask what the way forward is for the Iranian working class. And I'd love also to hear a little bit about like what the terrain is for the left in Iran.
I think that there's more people who are coming to this conclusion that neither the Iranian regime, neither US imperialism, or really any bourgeois regime is going to come and save Iran. And the question remains then, what is the alternative, right? Because it's not enough to say, we don't support this or that. What do we actually fight for then, right? And I think in one way or another, how this story in Iran and in countless other semi colonial countries has started is over the question of basic democratic rights. And there's a real burning desire in a country like Iran with just like, I mean, I don't know if you go on Instagram and you see like how beautiful the young people in Iran are in terms of like, their desire to live just like lives with dignity, right? And that's exactly why we're seeing protest movement after protest movement, even though people know the cost of repression is high, because they're willing to fight to the end for this democracy. But I think as leftists and as socialists especially, we have to always come back to the question of strategy. How are we going to get actual democracy, which we know doesn't even really exist under capitalism, even for people living in the US, because, Renee Good just got shot for being a legal observer, but it's obviously especially bad in countries like Iran. And Iran's a really interesting country because there's been generation after generation that's been trying to grapple with this question of strategy. And we had a really advanced experience in the case of the Iranian Revolution, which actually started because the Shah killed like 2,000 people in one day. I think Foucault was actually there as a journalist and wrote about it. And the oil workers organized a strike, which eventually spread to a general strike that paralyzed the entire economy, a strike for political reasons against the repression and the dictatorial regime of the Shah that was organized through, they were initially called strike committees. So because, whenever you organize a strike, especially when you're organizing it against the wishes of your union, you have to find a way to organize that with your coworkers, right? And so it kind of emerged out of a real necessity. How do we organize this? And they organized strike committees, and eventually they realized, well, we can make decisions about our whole workplace using this kind of self-organization. And there were even they were called shuras, these sort of councils or soviets, and they were even, shuras in neighborhoods, in rural communities, not even just in workplaces. So there was this really, really rich experience that almost led to a situation of dual power where, at the very least, the shuras had complete control over the economy, even though they didn't have control over the political regime. And of course, all of that was dismantled because the Islamic regime worked hand in hand with US imperialism to try and prevent that process from continuing. But I do think that it offers a lot of lessons. And even today, we're seeing in the past few years, we've seen small examples of councils reappearing in Iran, even in a situation where it's super hard to organize in Iran. They're useful to organize our struggles to coordinate between different sectors. There was a statement from a council that formed in Arak in the Markazi province during these recent protests. So there's been a sort of small but important revival of this question of self-organization. But I think that question is only useful strategically as long as it is a way for us to organize in reality independently of any sector of the bourgeoisie, whether it's the US bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie in Iran. That's what makes self organization allow workers to actually organize themselves independently and pose a real alternative. It's a really important strategical debate for Iran right now because the question is not, do the Iranian masses want a different system? It's, well, how are we going to get that system and what kind of system? And I think the second part of that answer is, well, if capitalism prevents us from having our rights because the bourgeoisie like benefits from us being divided and benefits from us, not being able to do everything that we want to do in our interests, then we actually do have to change the system at its roots. And I think that part of the question is also really important in terms of what kind of Iran and what kind of Middle East do we fight for, right? Because this question also passes through liberation for Palestine. Because as we know, like there's a genocide in Palestine because there's a sector, like the ruling class benefits from that genocide, right? And until we take power from them, then it's only going to continue in one form or another. So that's why I do think like this question of self-organization, organizing independently as workers in socialism is really important. And it's promising that we're seeing seeds, like very small seeds of that in terms of the workers' movement in Iran. And even, for example, the oil workers, the ones who are more precarious and have contracts, organized a strike a few years ago. So I think people are really coming to that consciousness again that the working class organize on its own is where we have the power to actually change the situation. But of course, in unity with young people, with all of the oppressed minorities in Iran, with the powerful feminist movement that can also play a role in imposing a totally different society.
I love this point about, what kind of Middle East, for example, do we fight for and connecting these struggles. I mean, as we always say, capitalism is a global system, imperialism is a global system, and it's completely inextricable from capitalism. So this brings me to kind of one of my last questions, I guess, which is this issue of getting people to care about the situation. Because people, especially in the US, might wonder why this matters. And we've talked a lot about the challenges of building an anti war movement, I mean, let alone like a broad anti imperialist movement. So, what would you say to people who are wondering why we should care about the situation in Iran? And as a follow up to that, you spoke earlier about the role of the Iranian working class. What is the role of the international working class? Like, what can the US working class do, for example?
I want to start by answering it actually. Marjan Satrapi, who's the author of Persepolis, which is a book that a lot of people know, I'm going to like paraphrase a quote that she said basically, which was that you and I, as Iranians and people who live in the US who are part of the masses or the working class, have more in common with each other than we do with our own governments. Our generation is slowly starting to see that. The same apparatus that killed Renee Good is the same apparatus that is part of the genocide in Palestine that will willingly do a regime change in Iran. It's just like becoming more evident that we have common enemies around the world. But I think there is a question of organization. And it goes back to even what I was just saying earlier. How do we organize ourselves independently from below? Here in the US, we have a lot of young people, a lot of people in the working class coming to this conclusion, but we have bureaucracies, for example, in our workplace, even the ones who maybe in their discourse will say that they support workers in other countries. The moment we say, we want to actually do something about it using our power, are going to try and put brakes on that. It's really important that we find a way to build this movement from below, knowing that we're going to have to put up a fight with those leaderships in our workplaces, in our movements, in our universities, but knowing that that is the only way that we can actually put our internationalism in practice. The recent example in Italy is just so beautiful and inspiring in that sense, because it was just a small glimpse, because there were workers in strategic sectors, the port workers, who organized independently from below a general strike in coordination with young people and students. And they did that for Palestinians. They shut down the levers of production in Italy, which is an imperialist country under a right-wing government. So I do think that we have to fight for this kind of anti-imperialist movement, not an anti-imperialist movement that's organized from above, whether that means, like we were talking about earlier, supporting any of these, bourgeois repressive regimes like the Maduro regime, like the Iranian regime, but one that's actually organized from below, especially in imperialist countries, because anything that we do against our government reverberates around the world, and our governments know that, and that's why we're seeing attacks against the left, against the Palestine movement, to try and weaken us. And we have to confront those attacks as well. I just want to say that all of these struggles are linked together, whether it's the struggle against ICE, the struggle for a free Palestine, the struggle in solidarity with Iranians, the struggle in solidarity with Venezuelans. As workers and as activists here in the US, we have to find a way to organize this perspective into action from below.
I think that's a really powerful way to end it. Maryam, thank you for coming back to the podcast.
Thank you so much.